Welcome to Gen Z Deep Dive, Season 3. I'm your host, Aaron Brown, Chair of the Institute for Generational Dynamics. 2020 has been a tumultuous year. In the past couple of months, with the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, we realized that our nation is in turmoil. And so instead of doing an episode where I talk to you about what is going on with the state of Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, and Baby Boomers, we invited Shawn Madison, a Gen Z African-American man, to come on our show and share his thoughts on the very present turmoil that we are experiencing here in America. As you'll find throughout this episode, turmoil is the right word. And we are deeply grateful, tons of gratitude for Shawn sharing his thoughts. So without much further ado, please meet Shawn Madison.
So my passion for politics really started when I was about 5 years old. My grandpa would take me to go canvassing with him and door knocking in the 2000 presidential election. And, I loved it from there. Like, I loved meeting new people. I loved trying to push, I don't want to say push an agenda, but push a campaign that my family believed in. And granted, I was only 5 years old, but I just loved it from there. And I loved watching the news all the time. I would stay up late just to watch the news, the 10 o'clock evening local news, and just grew a passion from there, just from learning and listening and seeing how politics is a vehicle to get to government in order to make a change to impact people's lives for the better. And from there, spurred the love of country. Normally it's the love of country that spurred your love for politics, but for me, it was the reverse. And from there, I love my country. I love what we stand for. I love the fact that we have a long way to go in achieving those founding principles that we were founded on. But because of that, that's why I felt called, if you will, to devote myself to politics and to the political sphere for the rest of my life. And as of the past 7 or 8 years, I have worked on countless political campaigns, whether from local as they can get, like tax auditor, to as high as a U.S. Senate campaign. I've been working for a presidential campaign during a primary season in 2016. So, those things, every campaign is different. I've learned, just like every experience is different and every person is different. So I love that aspect of it. I love the fact that I got to do it while I was in college and sometimes earn college credit for it too. I realize that in politics and in government, there is a lack of leadership. And so while going to school, learning about things concerning leadership, it was very easy for me to see sort of the vacuum and to see the gap that was missing. Because I'd learn things from you in our leadership classes, and then I'd learn, and then I'd go out into the world and see how politics works. And I'm like, well, only if there was a leader that would do this or would say this, then maybe this is how it could be better. So yeah, it's kind of my background of how I got started in politics and government. So yeah.
Shawn, you are African American. I'm sure that's not a surprise to you. Yes, you're telling me things I know. You're African American. You're 24. Is that correct?
That's correct.
24. So you fall into what we at the Institute would term Gen Z. You were a little disappointed when you found out you were Gen Z the other day.
I was just a smidgen. Yeah.
I embrace my millennial identity when I don't return text messages. Like, well, I'm just being a millennial. When I look for, started intermittent fasting, only millennials could skip a meal and create something new and call it fasting. So
and profit off of it.
Right. I just try to embrace it as much as possible. So I think you should embrace your Gen Z-ness as much as possible. So with all of that said, you're actually probably more of a cusper. And so for our audience out there that may not be familiar with all the terminology we use at the Institute, a cusper is someone who is born on the cusps of a new generation. So, if you're 26 and a millennial, you're more of a cusper. You're going to have some millennial qualities as well as Gen Z qualities, because 25 is the beginning age right now for Gen Z. So Shawn's 24, so he's most likely a cusper. Shares some of those qualities here and there. One thing that you and I really dove into a couple of weeks ago on the 4th of July was just the turmoil that America is currently in, and all of the various perspectives that are out there when we're seeing potentially reform on police brutality, knock and enter issues that cost one young lady her life here a few months ago. We see what has happened with, I believe, Rashard Brooks down in Atlanta, Georgia, and some of the turmoil that has followed that incident. We're also seeing New York City basically telling cops they can't retire early because there's been a 400% increase in retirement applications given with what has happened in New York City. So the world is in turmoil. I know I've used that word a few times, but I think it is appropriate to some degree. So just wanted to kind of dive in, since the name of the show is Gen Z Deep Dive, dive into your experience as a young African-American man, especially because Gen Z is the most racially diverse generation that we have had in America. So right now, Pew Research would say about 52%, or 1 out of every 2 Gen Zers is Caucasian. And I believe the numbers that go along with that is 25% are Hispanic, 14% are Black, 6% are Asian, and 5% are others. So yeah, it's the most diverse generation that we have had thus far. So we'd just love to kind of hear your experience as a young African-American man growing up in the South. Shawn is from Louisiana. He currently resides back in Louisiana after college. So let me not tee this up anymore. Why don't you go ahead and take the swing?
Sure. So there's a lot to go there. So I'll try to make this as succinct as possible. Anyone who knows me knows that I can be a very long-winded person. So I'll try to not be so long-winded today. When it comes to my experiences in relation to all the turmoil going on, just to not beat a dead horse, but that's really the best word to describe everything going on. I think of my experiences in relation to it all. I have had similar negative experiences. I have had not pleasant experiences, not necessarily just with police officers, but with white people, with friends, with family members that look like me, and with family members who don't look like me. I come from a mixed race family, so we're kind of a mosaic of people, if you will. And the one thing that I realized in all of the experiences is that the one biggest underlying message that connects them all is ignorance. And to me, it's ignorance of, well, I don't know what someone else is going through, and I don't care to learn. So I'm going to make this assumption about them, and I'm going to assume this about them and how they act and this, that, and the other, which is wrong. No matter what color you are, that's a wrong thing to do. But I'll go into a couple of details. So when I was 5 years old, I was in kindergarten, and I was told by a friend of mine that I couldn't play with him and the other boys because I was Black. And I was like, no, I'm not. And I showed him the inside of my hands, my palms, and I said, look, I'm white just like you are. And I went home crying that day, and I didn't tell my teacher because I don't know why I didn't tell my teacher, but I went home crying that day. My mom had to sit me down and explain to me the differences between us, in that the fact that the only difference between us was that I happened to be darker and I had more of a tan than he did. But that didn't make me any different. That didn't make me any less than or any better than. It's just that I looked a little bit different than him. That didn't deter me from having friends. I went to predominantly white institutions of schooling from kindergarten all the way through high school, even my college time. I was oftentimes one or the only, or maybe one of two or three Black students in my class. I was always in honors and gifted classes as well in middle and high school. And I never really had that many other African American students in my classes. I think I can point to one or two. So being in those spaces, being at those tables, opened me up to a different worldview that was not just the one that I was accustomed to. So I had to learn myself, and this is how other cultures interact. This is how other people interact with each other based on who they are. For me, I always got asked the questions, of, well, hey, your mom's Black. Does she wash her hair every day? Or, hey, do Black people cook this way? Like, do they all like fried chicken and watermelon? And like, you look at those things today and you cringe and you're like, man, why did they think that? But I also look back to the way I felt in that moment, and I thought back to what my grandpa always told me, and that was to always take a moment to educate whenever possible. Don't escalate a situation. And in those moments, I would say, yeah, my mom washes her hair. My mom washes her hair just like your mom washes her hair. Like, no, we don't all like fried chicken and watermelon. I like fried chicken because I just like it. But I hate watermelon. That doesn't make me any less Black, though, right? And I would say, just because I like something and someone else doesn't like it doesn't make me or them any more or less Black, just like it doesn't make you any more or less white. So I remember those moments.
Just for the record, I love fried chicken. And I really enjoy watermelon. I just want to get that out there. I know it's burning on everybody's minds. But...
And for the record, Aaron Brown and I have shared a lot of fried chicken meals together.
Tons of Church's chicken. Tons of Church's chicken.
And Popeyes, most importantly. So, I remember those times, and technically they were called microaggressions because they were said in oftentimes a very condescending way, but I never took them in a condescending way. And that's not to say that I'm better because I had taken it in a condescending way and I didn't get mad. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is I chose how I was going to react, because I realized, for one, I have to go to class with these people every single day. I was probably going to be in class with them for the next several years. I didn't want to pick a fight with them over something what I viewed as so small that could have been quashed and nipped in the bud. For what that could have had a longer lasting effect. I was involved in student council when I was in high school, and there was a student council camp that we would always go to in the summertime, and I got asked to be on staff for that camp one year. Well, I went to a department store. I was looking for a shirt because we always had like a dance or ball kind of thing. I was looking for a shirt to go specifically with that event, and I walked in, and I was wearing Bermuda shorts, typical Vineyard Vines type shorts, and some boat shoes, and a button down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. It was a gingham shirt, actually. So I looked very much like what some Gen Z-ers would call a frat guy.
Were you wearing Sperry boat shoes?
I was wearing Sperry boat shoes, yes. The only brand to wear in boat shoes, yes.
Right.
Yeah. So I was your typical frat preppy guy in high school. That's what all of us dressed like. That's what we were comfortable in. And that was that. So I went in, and I went to go find a shirt, and I was in the Ralph Lauren section looking at a shirt. And I noticed that this lady was kind of following me, and I had a couple shirts in my hand to go try on in the fitting room. And every section I went to, she would follow me there, and I was like, she would say a distance, but she would always be looking, and I kept looking back at her. At one point, I said, "Well, ma'am, can I help you? Like, are you looking for something?" And she said, "Well, I just don't trust your kind, your type." And I said, "Oh, ma'am, I'm sorry." Me thinking like I'm young, I'm 16 years old. Like, she probably thinks that I'm one of those crazy 16-year-olds that wants to steal something. Mind you, at the time, I still looked like I was 35 when I was 16, so nothing has changed there. But I said, I'm not here to. I'm not like the other or my other peers. Like, I'm not here to steal anything. I can guarantee you that. Like, I would never do that. My mom is a very honorable and good son. But thank you for that. I said, I'm sorry that some other teenagers have been so mean and rude. She said, oh, I wasn't talking about you being young or a teenager. And I said, well, what were you talking about? Because me, I refuse to assume that, because I didn't quite think that was actually still a thing in 2012. Like, I refused to think that it was 2011. She said, well, Black people. I said, okay. So I walked over to her, I handed her the 4 shirts that were in my hand, and I said, I'm going to go find your manager because I need to file a complaint. And she said, do whatever you need to do. And I'm thinking, okay. So I went and filed a complaint. The manager was very apologetic. And the next time I went to that department store, that lady was no longer to be found. And I would oftentimes go to that department store for different sales or whatever, because I've always liked to shop, still do.
Just out of curiosity, how old would you guess that this lady was that insulted you and everything?
She was at least in her 50s.
Okay.
At least in her 50s. So at the time, a little bit older than my mom, but definitely in her 50s, I would say. And I thought at the time, like, I was very involved in high school. I was what we call Mr. Pioneer. I was like the pinnacle student, if you will, of spirit or whatnot. And my teachers were all 40 plus years old, right? So I thought that I had a rapport with people who were older than me that were my parents' age. In that moment, it kind of hit me, but like, not everyone views you the same way. You're still viewed as a threat just because you're Black, not because you're young, or just because you're Black. Not because you're like 6'1", like you look like you lift weights, but just because you're Black. None of those things were a threat except the fact that you were Black. So I went home and I cried in the car a little bit because I was like, well, gee, this is like what just happened to me was exactly kind of the catalyst for the things that happened to my grandpa and my grandma and the stories that I've heard from the Jim Crow era South. I was afraid. And that was the first time I'd ever been afraid in that moment and I thought to myself, how do I even tell my grandpa? How do I tell my mom? I don't know what they're going to do because I know that they love me, they want to protect me, but I don't want them to act irrationally, because no matter who you are, no matter what your skin color is, if you tell your parents or someone that loves you deeply something wrong that happened to you, there will be a visceral reaction. Everyone's different, but there will be some sort of visceral reaction,
Or a murder. I mean, it's one of the two,
murder,
right?
or murder, like murder or a punch thrown or some words thrown. Like there's no telling what could have happened, because I had never been in that situation to see how my mom would respond. And I didn't really want to see how she would respond. But I went home and she could tell that I was crying. She asked what was wrong, and I told her what happened. And I could tell that she was very angry, but she sat down and she explained to me, she said, Shawn, you have to realize that these things are not normal. They are not common, but they still are common enough to where you need to anticipate them and be ready to respond to them accordingly. And that's kind of, I think, how I live my life on a daily basis, is that seeing that these things aren't normal and being able to anticipate them in order to respond to them appropriately. I think a lot of the issues today that we face are the fact that people have responded inappropriately in some ways, and then the people who have responded appropriately haven't seen change as quickly as they would have liked. Both of those things can be valid. You can respond the wrong way, but you can also respond the right way and still not be heard. And a lot of the unrest that we're seeing, I believe, is from the fact that people have been responding appropriately. There used to be, there are people that say, well, as long as you obey the law, you're not going to get arrested. You're not going to get frisked. You're not going to get pulled over. As long as you don't talk back, you're not going to get arrested. As long as you don't wear your pants below your butt. I love those kind of microaggressions where we assume that just because you're Black and you wear jeans, they're going to be below your butt. Or as you just speak a certain way, no one's going to think secondly about you or think differently about you. Those things are wrong, because we wouldn't we wouldn't have to say that to our white friends and our white counterparts nearly as often as we say them to our black friends and counterparts. So it's those kinds of issues that I see kind of have bubbled over into today, that people are just fed up with it. I get it. I too am fed up with the fact that I sometimes have to overcompensate, and have to try to validate my blackness. And again, my blackness is just my skin color, right? I have to validate my blackness by going above and beyond to prove to someone that I'm not a threat. That my first impression of them has to be intentional, and that I am not here to threaten you or to threaten your life, but that I'm here to have a civil conversation with you, or to shop with you in a civil manner in a department store or in a boutique or in whatever. So that can get tiring. And that's why we've seen on Facebook and all the other social media platforms, we've seen people say, I'm tired. This is what they mean when they say I'm tired. I'm tired of having to go back and forth with the consistent trying to overcompensate for someone else or for your fears. I'm not responsible for your fears. I'm responsible for how I come off, So that, again, that's what I see is kind of bubbling up, and the way that people are expressing themselves are a lot different. Some people aren't talking. Some people aren't talking to their white friends. Some people are taking to the streets and protesting peacefully while wearing a mask. Some people are taking to the streets protesting not wearing a mask. Some people are rioting and are breaking things. There's a whole slew of different ways that people are responding to the same issue. But we can't marginalize them and generalize them that, oh, well, since they're doing this, they must not have had bad experiences either. I've seen a lot of that too. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot of problems on all sides of the pie, but we have to realize the principle and not get distracted away from the principle of what really it is. And that's the fact that America isn't where it needs to be when it comes to liberty and justice for all. There are still, unfortunately, different justice systems for different types of people, and that's wrong. But I think that's what should continue to spur us and encourage us to create that America that is far better than our parents or grandparents could have ever imagined it to be.
That's good. It reminds me of in the house of worship that I attend yesterday, our pastor and one of our elders had a conversation. They did more of a conversational sermon, and this particular elder is African American, military veteran, 23 years, and he said something that you just said. He said, "I'm not allowed to have a bad day. If I have a bad day, then I'm uppity, I'm belligerent, I'm this, I'm that, and that could put my life in jeopardy depending on who I am interacting with." So I think that's very sobering. And I also think that you have said it so simply that if we have listeners out there who have struggled with seeing the disparities, inconsistencies that exist in our interactions, I hope that what you've said is as simple as I believe it is, that they can now see that there is a difference in how African Americans are sometimes treated, especially interacting with just from the crazy lady who's following you around in the department store to getting pulled over for speeding or something like that. Switching gears just a little bit, Pew Research, again, I love Pew Research. Pew is a religiously based organization, but even atheists like Sam Harris will say Pew Research because it's a very reputable data gathering organization. They did a survey 3 weeks ago and discovered that 5 out of 6 protesters are actually Caucasian, not necessarily African American, not necessarily Hispanic. I was having dinner with friends who are Hispanic, and they were joking around about how you'll never see like a Brown Lives Matter movement because Mexican mothers will believe the police over their own children every time.
I've heard that. Yeah.
from your perspective, and we recognize that you're not speaking for everybody, you're speaking for yourself and your own experience, but what are your perceptions of the protests and the state of those things?
Yeah. So I was actually talking with a friend of mine who was one of my best friends. We've been friends for way too long. And she's a woman, and she's 20. She's my age, 24. Um, she is, at one point in time, she and I were completely opposite on political ideology,
Mm-hmm.
and but still we were the best of friends. And now she has moved more towards the center, which is nice. I have moved more towards the center as well. But she and I were talking about that fact that the majority of the protesters are white. She made a very interesting point to me. She said, I wonder if the white people that are marching and protesting, if they still feel a sense of fear whenever they walk past a group of black people in a grocery store. I wonder if they intentionally don't try to date black people, or that they swipe left when they're on a dating app or whatnot, when they see someone black without even looking at their profile. Like, I wonder if that's their first reaction. But I wonder how many of them are there in the protests just to be an opportunist on an aspect of social justice to make themselves feel better. That's a great question. I know a lot of people that I've seen posting on Facebook and all these other platforms that have not been the most caring people to someone who had more melanin in their body than they did. They have oftentimes shrugged them off because they are black or brown. So my concern or my hope is that they have changed. I can't say that I can see fruit from them changing just because they share something on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Anyone can do that. Anyone can press a button. But it's about your actions on a daily basis. But as far as the protests, this is kind of my theory with any protest. Protest has to be matched with some sort of, whether it's legislative action or lobbying action at the government level. So if I'm going to have a protest, I want to make sure that I'm backing up that protest with meetings with my legislators, to discuss the issues that are at hand. Because I can file a permit with the city, and I can have a protest, and I can march along these blocks, and I can pay for a police detail to make sure that everyone stays safe. But it can also end just right there, because starting a movement is easy. Sustaining a movement and putting it into legislative change and putting it into change that impacts generations is harder. The saying goes in politics, I'm going to relate it back to this: anyone can win an election, but not everyone can govern. We see that today in America. Anyone can win an election, but not everyone can govern. Governing is hard. So I just question whether or not the policies that are being promoted by some who are protesting, which if they are protesting, that is 100% you're right. I applaud you for protesting. I protested myself in different areas, but my question would be is that I wonder if you are also backing that up with tangible, pragmatic change that you're seeking to deliver. And in addition to that, change cannot happen overnight. Change will not happen overnight, and I don't think that change should happen overnight, because if it takes you 24 hours to change something, then it can also take you 24 hours to change it back to the way that it was. Sustainable change is not just something that's done willy-nilly, in the back room, and like suddenly, we've cured police reform, like we fixed police reform. No, police reform can't be fixed at the congressional level. Police reform is fixed at the local level, where we tie in local community leaders, faith leaders of that community, the community members themselves, with the police, with the governmental officials there, and we say, hey, these are the things that we see as a need. How can we bridge the gap? What can we do better on both sides? So the protests are great. I love the aspect of a protest. I would like to urge a word of caution. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic, but this is kind of two-sided, right? We're in the midst of a global pandemic at the moment. So if you are going to protest, please wear a mask. Gen Z, please wear a mask. Just because you will not be probably negatively affected by the coronavirus doesn't mean that you won't see your parents or grandparents who might have a worse outcome. That's my shameless plug for public health. But in addition to that, you see people are willing to risk their lives and risk being infected with a disease for the sake of their life, because they think that if they don't do this now, if they don't speak up now, they might not have a life to live in the future. They're fighting for more than just one cause. So again, I think that as long as you are protesting with something else that backs that up, I think that's a good thing. I think that's how you bring about positive change to your cause. And educating on why you're protesting is another thing. I know it's hard for us Black people and brown people to explain why my life might matter at a baseline level. I know that's hard. I know it's tiring, but we still have to do it. And I think that's where we have to pull on our strength that's stronger than we think we are, because we have to explain this to people. Because yes, it absolutely should be the thing where we shouldn't have to explain why my life matters. I understand that. It should not be a thing. But the reality is that it is a thing, and that we have to explain it. So we have to sometimes explain, hey, this is why this is the way it is. Yes, they can go and learn themselves, but if someone reaches out to you and says, hey, I would like to learn, I think that it's incumbent upon us to help those who are reaching out to us that want to learn. So I know I kind of went on different tangents there, but all in all, protests, great, but even greater and more important whenever they are followed up with some sort of concrete, pragmatic, practical, tangible action.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think that's something that, again, using the word turmoil, I think an interesting observation is Shawn King tweeted several weeks ago about many in the African American community may be saying vote, vote, vote. But I think correctly he observed we've been voting the way that we were told to vote for the last 20 years in Minneapolis. And Minneapolis is chock full, and has been for at least 10 plus years, of more of the progressive leaning political leaders. And still things like this have happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis. So I think we've come to a point where it's like we have to be, like you said, much more targeted with how we're following up. It's not just enough to elect somebody with who you think has the right letter preceding their name, right political party, but people who are actually intent on addressing the issues that we were concerned about. One thing that I would just add to that is, there's a term, I guess, white allies. And I remember not too long ago, it was a few years ago, there was a shooting. I think some police officers, I think in this particular instance, I'm trying to remember, a couple of police officers were killed. It was in response to an African-American dying potentially under police brutality. Again, I'm using this language because I can't remember the exact details, but I remember I was watching the news with a friend, and that friend said, I don't understand why they're saying Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. If your child was autistic and you were raising funds or some initiative to better the life of your autistic child, and somebody said, and you said, my autistic child's life matters, and somebody said, well, Down syndrome, all children's lives matter. Like, it's not just autistic, all. And the great thing has been seeing a shift in those last few years of just having that very simple conversation. Now, I've had other conversations that didn't shift a thing, but I think for white folk, Caucasians out there, a little bit of my Southerns coming out, but for white folk out there, that it is important that you take the time to explain to family and friends that are also Caucasian, white, why these things are important to Black people that you love, brown people that you love.
I think you made a very, very good point in the fact that, white people can have sort of an inroad with other white people just because they look like each other, and I think too, like, that goes back to one thing that I always point to, and that is relationship. Like, yes, more people are realizing that Black Lives Matter isn't just the organization that has political views, but that it's also a statement. and that in some ways that statement has been hijacked to promote another political cause, right? It's
Sure.
an opportunist statement or an
Sure.
opportunist
Yeah.
thing for sure. But the statement that Black life matters shouldn't be politicized, because Black life does matter and Black life should matter in America and around the world. But I think too that happened. That change was slower than it should have been, but the change still happened. And how many times have we been wanting some sort of political reform or some sort of change here in America? And it's happened slower than we wanted it to happen, but it still happened, and we're thankful for when it happened. I'm thankful for the fact that friends of mine who were very anti-Black Lives Matter completely 2 or 3 years ago are now saying, hey, Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying I agree with the organization and the things that they stand for, but the principal statement of Black Lives Matter, like I like that. Like that is the truth. That is 100% American. So I think that's another good thing, is that relationship really matters. And that relationship is how you're going to have an inroad with people to have that conversation of, hey, like, can I sit down and talk with you?
Yeah.
Like, you know, you trust me, you trust my opinions on things. Let me give you my opinion on this. And let me tell you why I think it's right. Let me tell you why, just like you said, well, what if your child was autistic, and then the person with Down syndrome said, hey, well, all kids matter. You know, I think that's a great example. So again, relationship is really, really important in this fight. And it's not going to be won in 2020. 2020 is a crazy year as it is. It's not going to be won in 2020 or 2021 or with the next election cycle. It's not going to be won because we put one party in power over the other party. It's going to be one when we have relationships with people that translate into positive and effective change that transcend party identification and party line. One party does not have the answer, but neither party in this country, neither major political party in this country have the answer to this.
Right.
And they both have screwed it up. Both parties have screwed up big time, right? And who has been the consequences of that? Black and brown people have had the consequences for their screw ups. But yet, nevertheless, we still persist and we still fight for our own life, and we fight to make our lives matter. I like to tell a story again, and I'm going to pause after this, but I tell a story all the time that, you know, my mentor, yours as well, is a Hispanic man. And I have heard things thrown out about Hispanic people that were very less than savory and that were racist. And he's heard things thrown out about me as a Black man. He's heard things thrown out about you as a white man. And yet, regardless of the issue, we all stand up for each other because we know each other and we have a relationship. But beyond that relationship, there's a basic level of human decency that we have, a basic level of respect that we have for our humanity, not just us as friends, but for our humanity. And I think that that's something that we need to get back in touch with in America, is like, where is our humanity? Where are the things that we care most about in all things? So yeah, I'm sorry to interject there. I just wanted to add.
No, I think it's great. Well, and at the end of the day, I think individuals who have such staunch attitudes about a race likely don't have personal and meaningful relationships with anybody from that race. And so until it becomes personal and humanized to you, it's easier to see somebody as a number or a statistic or something like that. So two other thoughts I want to chase as we wrap up the last 15 minutes of this. For myself and the Institute, our objective is not to become necessarily experts in critical race theory or anything like that. This podcast is about observations and gaining at least one person's perspective on some of these issues. A few weeks ago, a petition went up to oust UCLA professor, University of California, Los Angeles. He is an accounting professor. This accounting professor, I believe, is Caucasian. And, you know, a lot of students, all students in the U.S. had to go online with COVID-19. And so towards the end of the semester, as protests were gaining traction in the wake that the realization that Ahmaud Arbery had happened back in February, and it got glossed over seemingly by a corrupt district attorney, as well as COVID-19 just overshadowing it, the George Floyd death in Minneapolis. This UCLA professor received an email from a Caucasian student, and the Caucasian student basically said, you should give all the Black people in this class A's because they're too emotionally distraught to be able, I guess, to competently finish their final exam. And so the professor emailed the student back and said, I'm very sympathetic, and I understand, where you're coming from. I am bound by university policy on how grades and tests are administered, things like that. So the student's response was to label him a racist and to start a petition to get him fired. From where I'm sitting, it seemed almost racist on the part of the student to think that African American students in the class are incapable of finishing their exams. And, crises, turmoil affect all of us differently. But sometimes it seems like there is another insidious type of racism where white allies overcompensate and take on these kind of white savior complexes and speak for African Americans. And just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that very long tee up to the question.
Yeah. No worries. Yeah, I do. So that, like you just said at the end, like that to me is perfect example of this white savior complex. And that, I'm going to speak for you on your behalf without communicating with all of you because I know what's best for all of you.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That is an issue. That's kind of the issue that we're standing up and fighting for today. Like, you can't make policies to benefit us and to protect us when you don't have us at the table to talk about it.
Right.
Black people have been through a lot of things and a lot of bad things and have still managed to persist to be very successful people as a whole. And I don't agree with that principle that we should assume that Black students are not capable of completing a class because of all the issues going on in the country. Because if that's the case, every Black student should have a diploma and a PhD for the past 5 or 6 years of issues that have been going on, right? Like, Black students should have gotten a high school diploma because that went to school when Barack Obama was president, because there were so many microaggressions because there was a Black president at the time, and that you were assumed to have supported him even though you were 16 years old and you literally couldn't vote. So I don't like those types of things. What I rather us as Black people say, you know what, we see these things going on, but we're going to show them that we can also walk and chew gum at the same time. I can continue to get my education. I can continue to make good grades in school, in higher education, while also fighting for justice and equality at the judicial level or at the justice level. So I think that that almost is like, I would be offended if someone told me that, I should do that. Now, the professor, I'm sure, would have handled it on a case-by-case basis if the student would have reached out and said, hey, I'm having a hard time with this. Like, can I get an extension on this or whatnot? I am quite positive that any professor would have gone through that, right? I remember I was in school. I was in college, and there was a time where 2 of my cousins were murdered at an act of hate at one point in time. I think you were there. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you were. I remember telling you about this. And I told 2 of my professors at the time, and they said, take your time on the projects and assignments due. I'm not giving you a due date for them to be done. Take your time to process and to heal. And that was it. There was no explanation. There was no nothing. There was no.
We'll bring you 2 funeral programs. And,
right. Like,
yeah.
I want to see this. Like, I want to know. I didn't wind up going to the funeral either, because my mom was like, I don't trust it. I don't know what's going to happen. Like, there's a lot of police that are going to be there because it is a very hot investigation.
Yeah.
So I didn't wind up going, and that did eat me alive on the inside.
Mm.
And I remember that moment, and I'm like, man, like I also, and my mom told me at the time, she said, but grieve, but you have to actively grieve too. You
Mm-hmm.
know, don't just sit there and not do anything for a month. You're still in school. You still got work to do. And that the principle that I realized in that moment was that life goes on in the midst of injustice. Life goes on in the midst of persecution, in the midst of turmoil, which is the overarching theme of today. And that life goes on even when people like us are being gunned down. Life goes on when we're being arrested and thrown in prison for 30 years for crimes that we didn't commit.
Mm-hmm.
Life goes on for others of us so that we can get those people out of jail for crimes that they didn't commit. So I don't want anything to be handed to us at any point in time for the sake of when we get to those positions of power and those tables of influence, they can't have the right to say, well, you were just handed that, or you were just given this. So you didn't work hard for this. So like, you don't have the right to say this or that or the other. Like, I don't want that. I want us to be better. I want us to be better than that moment of, well, you should just give them all A's. Like, what does that teach us? And I think that the overwhelming majority of African American students would have rejected that notion as well. I mean, sure, in the moment it would have sounded great because, I mean, every college student is like, man, I wish I could like just not have to do this assignment and whatnot. Oh, especially in accounting. Oh my gosh. I second guess whether or not I would have taken that option, but I'm only kidding. But I mean, like we go to college for something bigger than ourselves. The majority of African American students go to college for a reason and an issue bigger than just us. We go because we're bearing the weight of our family's expectations on us to do better and to make something great of our lives, as well as the entire nation. That we're being looked on with a magnifying glass, and we want to do everything that we can to be the best we can be.
So I lied, second to last question. So a few weeks ago, I saw a video, and it was where a group of protesters wanted to tear down a statue of Lincoln. Lincoln is standing. There is an emancipated person who has one shackle, I believe, on the left hand, and that shackle is not fettered. The statue was completely paid for by emancipated persons after the Civil War. Frederick Douglass, perhaps, the most prolific African-American thinker, rhetorician, the whole nine yards, next to Martin Luther King Jr., gave the commemorative speech for this statue. There was a group of protesters that want to tear this statue down. And even when they were given the history of it, that it was paid for solely by emancipated persons, and there was a elderly lady who was smiling and explaining the significance of, like, the emancipated person is not, his head is not down in subservience, but he is actually rising to stand with Abraham Lincoln as an equal. These protesters rejected that and said, well, they just couldn't fully appreciate how this statue would look in the modern day. And I think there's many of us who would say Black Lives Matter. We need to address police brutality, other issues but we're still completely flabbergasted by this position that a group of emancipated people could not appreciate what the statue would look like 160 years later. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or insight into that.
Yeah, so I have seen that statue in person in my times that I've gone to Washington, D.C. And to see it in person versus to hear about it is a whole different story. Mm-hmm. I had heard about that statue from my grandfather, who had never gone to Washington, D.C. And he would always tell me that, I really wish you could go there and take a picture of that statue. And so I have a picture with that statue, as a matter of fact. And I just remember just the joy that it brought to his eyes, knowing that, like, hey, like this is the real deal kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think one of the main things with the issue of statues, and this is coming from someone who grew up in the Deep South, his entire life. For those of you who don't know, I live right outside of New Orleans. And New Orleans and Louisiana as a whole is a very, very entrenched Confederate history. Um, some of the main thoroughfares, street names of our or streets of our city are named after Confederate generals. The president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, was or is a main thoroughfare or main street throughout our city. We have this thing called Lee Circle, where there's a large pedestal with a statue of Robert E. Lee atop of it. We have different Confederate generals around the city and around the state, as well as different slave owners and slave traders who things were named after. My thought on monuments, and I'm going to say this and then I'm going to get back to the original question. My thought on monuments is that, for one, from an American history standpoint, they shouldn't have gone up in the first place, because I can't think of any nation in the world, which I'm open to being corrected, but I can't really think of any nation in the world that waited, I don't know, let's say 70 to 80 years after the Civil War, after their Civil War.
It was about 30 years after the Civil War when the first one.
Well, for a lot of those, for a lot of the Confederate monuments, some of those didn't go up until the 30s, 40s, 50s, or 40s, 50s, 60s.
Sure.
Particularly in Louisiana. I can't think of any country that after the Civil War was fought, almost a century after, we would put up monuments to honor those people.
Right.
Unless there was for some sort of insurrection type cause. I just can't think of anything that would do that, right? Because when you have a war and you lose the war, the victor takes over things and resets the narrative of things that happen. That was kind of an issue to me. Like, I don't think this should have gone up in the first place, but I also am not of the fan of the opinion that tearing them down, by breaking the law, because technically it is breaking the law because it is public property. I don't think that tearing them down by breaking the law or is the right message either. I say, why don't we go about this in a peaceful way? And they say, well, we've been peaceful for too long. They don't listen to peace. Fair, very fair. But have we even tried? Have we even tried is what I question. Why don't we go about taking these things down in a peaceful way, in order to, we go through our city council, our parish council, our state legislature, to go and say, hey, like, this is what the majority of people want. Can you please take this down? And you can replace it with something else. You can rename this with something else. But as far as the Abraham Lincoln statue goes, I don't agree with the notion of wanting to take it down. We can easily say that, the David statue in Italy should be taken down because it's naked. I mean, I'm sure people have thought that before, but like, it's still a work of art. And I'm not a fan of the aspect of people trying to change the opinions of people who lived 150 years ago just to make ourselves feel better about it. I think that those monuments like that, specifically the Abraham Lincoln one with the slave or the freed slave, I think monuments like that should serve as a testament at the fact that we were once in a place in America where a president could stand next to a person in shackles, as a person who was once owned by someone else. I think that is a better method of appreciating that rather than trying to take it down. I think the lack of knowledge, the lack of education is so deep and so entrenched in a lot of the things that we protest for. And I don't think that that's right either, because what's the point in protesting for something that we don't know why we're protesting for? What's the point in taking down a statue that we don't know why we're taking it down? Like, why was the Frederick Douglass statue beheaded in one place and then it was thrown down in another place? I mean, really, like, Frederick Douglass was literally an abolitionist who was willing to give his life to free people. He was a freed slave. Like, I don't understand these things,
Yeah.
So those are the issues that I have a problem with. If we wanted to remove the Abraham Lincoln statue, by all means, go about it in the proper way, since it is on public property. File a petition with the Washington D.C. Council. But people don't want to do that because people are so impatient, and especially Gen Z, my generation, are so impatient. We want change right away.
Mm-hmm.
Well, change doesn't happen right away. It doesn't. We have to sometimes deal with things that we don't like. for a long period of time. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. I hate that sometimes, but also I appreciate it sometimes, because it also means that we're not going to have this constant ebb and flow of changes in government all the time, and changes in policy every single day. That is not sustainable. That is not a representative of a stable republic that we have. So I also am of the opinion that we just can't go out there breaking the law. We have to obey the law. And they say, well, our grandparents didn't obey the law. They boycotted things, and they had sit-ins. Those are different issues when they come, because they weren't vandalizing something to progress their cause. They were sitting there and they were saying, I am a paying patron and I have a right to be here, but you don't want me here. Like, you literally let me come in, but you don't want me here anymore, even though you literally said that I can come in. So those are just two different issues as well. I don't think that we can compare the two. And the other thing, last thing, I promise. The other thing that I think we as Gen Zers need to do, or that we should do, I don't like telling people what they need to do, what we should consider doing, is to listen and learn from people who have gone before us. Sit down and talk with someone who's over the age of 50. My mom is 53 years old, and she was the first group, well, part of the first busload of Black students to integrate her her elementary school in 1971. Like, I mean, my mom is as generically American as anyone else. I would have never imagined, like, if you meet her, you never imagine that she was a part of that civil rights movement in her own way. But, like, sit down and talk to someone who's older than you, who's gone through certain things. Sit down and learn from them about the principles that they went through. Because what we're seeing today isn't anything new. There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
It's just a cycle, right? So someone has been through this at some point in their life. We should learn from them and not make their same mistakes.
No, that's great. That's great. Well, you actually answered my last question. I was going to say, Shawn, just so I can ask it. So I'm going to say, Shawn, give us some insight into what you're seeing with your millennial and Gen Z friends on the issues of race. Do you think that millennials and Gen Z are more racist, just as racist, maybe less racist today? What do you think are the glimmers of hope, and what do you think are the areas that still need help?
That's a good question.
That's why I asked it.
I think I think that Gen Zers are not nearly as overt with their prejudices. I think that's the grammatically correct way to word that. There are things that Gen Zers can do differently that I think we should consider doing differently. I was on TikTok, right? That's the Gen Z thing to do nowadays. It is a Chinese scam, yes, I know, but it is very addictive. And I was on TikTok several weeks ago when the unrest really was having its peak. And I saw so many TikToks where they were saying, I'm only going to date Black men and women. Like, people would say that. And I'm like, that's not the answer to this. No. Dude, that's not what we want. That's not what we want. Or, Black people are better than everyone else. And I'm like, no, that's not. And these are all white people that were saying these things. And I'm like, no. That's not what we want. Don't do that. Don't hijack this moment for your own personal clout moment. Like, stop seeking clout and do what's right. So yes, I do think that Gen Z has some racist undertones in their way of thinking, but they're so entrenched in their personal ideology that they don't realize that it's prejudiced, because they do so many other things that are not racist. And they have so many Black friends, and they have so many Hispanic friends, and so many Asian friends, right? And so it's like, well, there's no way that I can be that because I love culture. Well, you might love culture, but you can also love it by not appropriating it either. When you have your Thanksgiving meals, don't sit there and dress up like Pocahontas. I mean, like, don't do that. Like, it's things like that they think are still okay. Or, well, only it's for Halloween, so I can do that. No, like, those are the simple undertones that we don't realize that we have. So I do think that Gen Z still has some racial insensitivities to get over, But I really do believe that Gen Z is definitely the generation to make sure that that is trashed over, or that is shoved over to the ash heap of history as well, because they might realize that that's within them, and they are quick to get rid of it because they do not want to be canceled, for fear of being canceled, for fear of being ostracized from their friends, for fear of having any, or being canceled on Twitter or something, you know. But that's another issue too. Like we also have to realize that people can make mistakes, people can recover from those mistakes as well, and not be so quick to cancel them. But we have to work on reconciling issues and having conversations about it. So yeah, Gen Z does have some issues to deal with, but they're not nearly as many as I would say millennials, definitely not baby boomers, or Gen Xers came before baby boomers, but definitely not as many as Gen Xers. But I also think that Gen Zers need to listen more and learn from our millennial and Gen X parents of, hey, why do you have these thoughts? Like, why do you feel this way about a certain type of people? Learn from them, realize that they might have a reason behind it because they may have had a bad experience. And then we can go back at them with some more education and what our educational thoughts are. So we've got to be open to dialogue for sure. And I think Gen Z is going to be the generation to change the world. Sorry, millennials, but I think we're going to change the world. And again, I'm a cusper, so I kind of straddle the fence, if you will. But I think we're going to change the world.